George Cooper Sr. is one of the most divisive characters in young Sheldon. Depending on who you ask, he was either the heart of the Cooper family or the source of many of its biggest problems. Throughout the series, George made countless sacrifices for his wife and children, but he also made mistakes that damaged his marriage and family life. Today, we're comparing George Cooper's most loved actions with his most hated ones to see which side truly defines him. Let's start with the moments that made fans love George. One of George's greatest strengths was that he always put his family before himself, even when it cost him everything. The biggest example came when he was offered the opportunity to become an assistant coach at a university in Oklahoma. It was a dream job that would have meant more money, better stability, and a fresh start. George wanted the position, and after years of sacrificing for everyone else, he finally had something that was for him. But Mary didn't want to move. Meemaw also pressured him to stay. In the end, George quietly gave up the opportunity. He never blamed his family, even though it was obvious how much the decision hurt him. Instead of chasing his own happiness, he stayed because he believed his family's needs came first. Many fans consider this one of the greatest sacrifices made by any parent in the series. George also had a special relationship with Missy. Unlike Sheldon, Missy often felt overlooked because so much attention was focused on her gifted brother. George noticed this more than anyone else. Whether he was taking her out for a father-daughter dinner at Red Lobster, teaching her baseball, encouraging her when she doubted herself, or simply listening when nobody else would, he constantly reminded Missy that she mattered. One of the most emotional moments came during the tornado. As the storm destroyed homes across Medford, George's first instinct wasn't to save himself. He rushed to protect Missy, putting himself directly in danger. It perfectly summed up the kind of father he was. When his family needed him most, George was always there. George's relationship with Sheldon was more complicated, but it also contained some of his finest moments. Sheldon rarely shared George's interests, and George barely understood advanced physics or mathematics. Yet he never stopped supporting his son's dreams. He drove Sheldon across the country to attend important scientific events, encouraged him to pursue college at a young age, and comforted him whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. One memorable example came when Sheldon suffered stage fright before giving a speech. Rather than mocking his fears, George calmly talked him through the situation, helping him find the confidence to step onto the stage. George didn't always understand Sheldon, but he always tried. George also proved what kind of father he was after Georgie got Mandy pregnant. Instead of throwing his son out of the house or abandoning him, George stood by him. He welcomed Mandy into the family despite the awkward circumstances and supported both of them as they prepared to become parents. While George wasn't happy about the situation, he chose responsibility over anger. Another reason fans admired George was his willingness to admit when he was wrong. Unlike many television fathers, George apologized when he crossed the line. He wasn't perfect, but he tried to become better after making mistakes. Even complete strangers benefited from George's kindness. When Veronica came to the Cooper house after problems at home, George protected her and confronted the abusive man threatening her. It was one of the clearest examples that George wasn't just a good father, he was a good man. Despite these moments, George also made decisions that earned heavy criticism. His biggest flaw throughout the series was his troubled marriage with Mary. Their relationship slowly deteriorated as communication broke down. Instead of discussing problems openly, George often bottled up his frustrations or escaped through football, television, or alcohol. Mary, meanwhile, became increasingly controlling and judgmental, creating a cycle that pushed both of them further apart. One of the most controversial storylines involved Brenda Sparks. After both marriages began falling apart, George and Brenda developed an emotional connection. They spent time together alone, comforted each other, and eventually met privately at Brenda's house with romantic intentions. Although they stopped before anything physical happened, many fans still considered it emotional cheating. George knew he was crossing a line, and even he admitted it felt wrong. Another common criticism was George's drinking. While young Sheldon never portrayed him as an out-of-control alcoholic, he frequently turned to beer whenever life became stressful. His drinking often became a symbol of how he coped, by avoiding problems instead of solving them. George also struggled with his nervous temper. Financial pressure, work stress, and constant family conflicts occasionally caused him to yell at Mary or the children. While he usually regretted these outbursts afterward, they still left lasting emotional scars. His relationship with Sheldon wasn't always positive either. George sometimes dismissed Sheldon's fears or failed to appreciate how differently his son's mind worked. Rather than understanding Sheldon, George occasionally expected him to behave like every other child, leading to frequent clashes between them. Missy also suffered because of the family's constant focus on Sheldon. Although George treated Missy better than most family members did, there were still moments when he overlooked how isolated she felt, especially during the later seasons. George's communication problems affected nearly every relationship he had. Instead of talking through difficult emotions, he often stayed silent until his frustrations exploded into arguments. This pattern became one of the biggest reasons his marriage continued to decline. Still, one important detail separates George from many flawed television fathers. Whenever he realized he had hurt someone, he genuinely tried to fix it. He apologized, he reflected, and more often than not, he made the effort to become a better husband and father. By the time Young Sheldon reached its emotional conclusion, many viewers realized something surprising. The George Cooper described in The Big Bang Theory wasn't the man they had spent 7 seasons watching. Instead of an uncaring, selfish father, audiences saw a hardworking coach who loved his family, sacrificed his dreams, supported his children, and made mistakes that many ordinary people make under enormous pressure. George's greatest strength was that he always showed up when his family needed him most. His greatest weakness was that he didn't always know how to deal with his own pain. In the end, George Cooper wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was simply human. And perhaps that's exactly why so many fans ended up loving him. But if we're judging George Cooper by his actions, there's one question that matters more than anything else. Did the good outweigh the bad? Looking at the evidence throughout the series, it's difficult to ignore just how often George chose his family over himself. When Sheldon wanted opportunities that no ordinary child would ever receive, George made them happen. He drove him to colleges, scientific lectures, and academic events even though he barely understood the subjects. He sat through conversations about physics and science because he knew they mattered to Sheldon. When Georgie made the biggest mistake of his life by getting Mandy pregnant, George didn't abandon him. Instead, he helped Georgie prepare for adulthood, supported Mandy during her pregnancy, and welcomed baby Cece into the family. George understood that his son needed guidance, not rejection. When Missy felt invisible, George consistently reminded her that she wasn't. Some of the series' most heartfelt scenes came from the quiet conversations between George and Missy. Unlike Sheldon, who usually spoke through logic, George connected with Missy emotionally. He listened without judging, encouraged her talents, and made time for her when few others did. These weren't isolated moments. They happened repeatedly throughout all 7 seasons. Even George's coaching reflected the same values. His players respected him because he believed in second chances, teamwork, and loyalty. While he wasn't the most successful coach in Texas, he cared deeply about the young men he coached. But that doesn't erase the damage caused by his mistakes. His arguments with Mary became more frequent as the series progressed. Their marriage reached a point where even simple conversations turned into fights. George often felt that Mary made decisions without considering his opinion, while Mary believed George wasn't taking enough responsibility at home. Instead of confronting these issues together, they slowly drifted apart. This is exactly what opened the door for Brenda Sparks. Although the show stopped short of showing a physical affair, George knowingly allowed himself to become emotionally attached to another woman while still married. He sought comfort from Brenda rather than working through his problems with Mary. Even if nothing physical happened, many fans felt he had already crossed a boundary. Another criticism involves how George handled stress. Whenever life became overwhelming, his first instinct was usually avoidance. He grabbed a beer, watched television, or buried himself in football, rather than discussing what was bothering him. While understandable, this habit often left Mary carrying the emotional burden of the household. George also wasn't always patient. There were times he yelled before listening, punished before understanding, or expected his children to simply get over it. Those moments revealed the flaws that made him such a realistic character. Ironically, many of George's worst worst qualities came from the same place as his best ones. He worked hard to provide for his family, but neglected his own emotional needs. Wanting to keep the peace, he often avoided difficult conversations until they turned into arguments. His strengths and weaknesses were closely connected. Perhaps that's why his death hit viewers so hard. George never got the chance to repair his marriage, see Sheldon graduate, watch Missy grow up, or witness Georgie build the successful business that would eventually support the family. He also never met the version of Sheldon who finally understood him. One of the most heartbreaking moments comes from adult Sheldon after George's death. Looking back, he realizes there were countless things his father did for him that he simply took for granted as a child. That realization changes everything. For years, The Big Bang Theory painted George as an irresponsible father who drank too much and cheated on his wife. But young Sheldon showed a man struggling with financial pressure, raising 3 very different children, and trying to hold his family together despite a failing marriage. George wasn't perfect. His temper, poor communication, drinking, and emotional connection with Brenda deserved criticism. But he also sacrificed career opportunities, protected his children, supported their dreams, stood by them after their mistakes, and loved them in ways they didn't fully appreciate until it was too late. In the end, George Cooper's legacy isn't defined by one mistake or one sacrifice. It's defined by the complete picture: a father who failed, a husband who struggled, a coach who inspired, and a man who loved his family even when he didn't always know how to show it. That's why, years after young Sheldon ended, fans are still debating him. Not because he was the best father on television, but because he felt like a real one. And maybe that's the biggest achievement of young Sheldon. It didn't ask viewers to excuse George's mistakes. It asked them to understand them. Throughout the series, George was constantly caught in difficult situations. He had one son who was a once-in-a-generation genius, another who suddenly became a teenage father, a daughter who often felt overlooked, a wife whose priorities frequently clashed with his own, and a job that barely paid enough to support everyone. That pressure doesn't justify his mistakes, but it explains them. Take his relationship with Sheldon. George didn't understand why Sheldon saw the world so differently, but whenever Sheldon truly needed him, he showed up. He encouraged him before important moments, supported his academic dreams, and helped create opportunities beyond Medford. George didn't always understand Sheldon, but he was there when it mattered. The same was true for Georgie. After Mandy became pregnant, George didn't abandon his son. Instead, he helped prepare him for fatherhood, welcomed Mandy into the family, and happily embraced his role as a grandfather when Cece was born. Then there's Missy. More than anyone else in the family, George noticed when she felt ignored. Whether they were fishing, throwing a baseball, sharing dinner, or simply talking, he gave Missy something she rarely received from the rest of the family: his full attention. Of course, none of this erases George's biggest mistake. His emotional connection with Brenda remains one of the series' most controversial storylines. Even though nothing physical happened, George sought comfort outside his marriage instead of fixing it. At the same time, the series shows that his marriage with Mary had been falling apart for years because both of them stopped communicating. That's what makes George such a fascinating character. Some viewers see a man who lacked ambition or struggled to express his feelings. Others see a father who sacrificed his own dreams, including the Oklahoma job, for the sake of his family. There isn't a simple answer. By the final season, many viewers realized something unexpected. The man they were told to dislike had quietly become one of the show's most lovable characters. Not because he changed, but because the audience finally saw the full picture. But there's one final question fans still can't agree on. If George Cooper was actually a good father, but the evidence throughout the 7 seasons points to one answer: that he was a good but flawed father. A good father isn't someone who never makes mistakes. It's someone who keeps trying despite them. George made plenty of mistakes, but whenever his family truly needed him, he was there. He believed in Sheldon's dreams, stood beside Georgie after he became a father, and always made sure Missy knew she mattered. Those weren't grand gestures. They were quiet acts of love, repeated throughout the series. That's why so many fans changed their opinion of him. Before young Sheldon, most viewers only knew George through Sheldon's memories in The Big Bang Theory. Those stories painted him as a drunk who yelled, cheated, and ignored his family. But young Sheldon gave viewers the full picture. As an adult, Sheldon admits there were many things he never appreciated while his father was alive. Only after George's death did he realize how much his father had quietly sacrificed for him. That's what makes George's death so heartbreaking. There was no chance to repair every mistake, no final conversation, and no opportunity for Sheldon to thank him while he was still alive. George never expected praise for working long hours, sacrificing career opportunities, or supporting his children. He simply did what he believed a father should do. But judging George only by his failures ignores everything else the series showed us. A father who worried about his children, sacrificed for his family, and tried to hold them together even as his marriage fell apart. In the end, George Cooper wasn't the monster many fans expected, nor was he a perfect husband or father. He was simply a man doing his best with the life he had. That's why, years after the finale, George Cooper remains one of the most misunderstood and ultimately one of the most beloved characters in young Sheldon. So what do you think? Was George Cooper a good father who made a few terrible mistakes? Or did his biggest failures outweigh all the sacrifices he made for his family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.